Good morning, everyone. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm Managing Editor at Australia Institute Press, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a special Australia's Biggest Book Club here in the studio with Dr. Emma Shortis.
Hi.
We're coming to you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. It was a beautiful frosty morning this morning, and I'd like to pay my respects to the people who've looked after this place for many, many millennia and continue to do so. So a reminder that you can register for our upcoming webinars on the Australia Institute website, australiainstitute.org.au. You can type questions for Emma using the Q&A box, and you can upvote other people's questions as well. Remember to keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or else we'll boot you out. And this is a live event and it's being recorded. The video will be available after the event on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. So Dr. Emma Shortis is Director of the International and Security Affairs Program here at the Australia Institute. You may well be familiar with her work. She does a lot of commentary, especially on the US election. She was a regular on ABC TV. She has a PhD in history, which she finished at Yale as a Fox Zucker International Fellow. And her first book, Our Exceptional Friend, was published by Hardy Grant in 2021. She's the host of the podcast After America. And the most recent episode featured former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Welcome, Emma.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's start by talking about After America as an essay, the essay form. So you've written in a lot of different genres. You've obviously done academic writing. You've written a book before. You do a lot of op-eds. What kind of opportunities does the essay form present for you?
Well, I think it's a lovely opportunity to extend thinking about the United States in a considered way that isn't as overwhelming as attempting to write a book. I think especially in the Trump era, the idea of writing 60 or 80,000 words on such a moving feast is kind of terrifying. And so the essay allows you, I think, to be considered and to look forward without being overwhelmed or even taking too much time when things are moving so quickly. So it's a really lovely opportunity, I think, to also reach a different audience, because it is relatively contained, but still, allows that opportunity to be a bit more thoughtful than an 800-word op-ed or, a 5 to 7 minute ABC interview. So it occupies, I think, a really lovely little space, and not many people are doing it as well.
And given your background as a historian, can you talk us through the kind of process that goes into developing a work like this? It's a bit different, it's a bit more responsive, and you're coming right up to the present day. First of all, how does your training as a historian inform your work? And then how is it different?
Yeah, sure. I think the training as a historian has been central to the way that I think about American politics in particular, because I'm writing really in the field of international relations, which is a very different discipline to history. But I think what the history allows me to do is to bring in the human aspect a lot more of American politics in particular, rather than thinking about it in the abstract, thinking about sort of broad concepts like American interests. We'll often hear that the United States wants to do this or the US has interest in doing this, but historical training allows you to see the role of an individual within those structures. And so that's why I made a real effort to write about some of the individuals that I met when I was in the States for the election and to put them in the broader context of what is happening in the United States. So I think having those kind of through lines of American history, but putting them in the present context, is hopefully a bit of a different way of approaching, how we think about the United States. And also, it's so easy to get sucked into the present when Trump is, tweeting one thing every 10 minutes and, just today talking about potential war with Iran. It's easy to get sucked into that vortex, and having a kind of historical basis for understanding Trump allows you, I think, to step back for a little while to really examine what he's doing and think through what the consequences might be.
Something that I think we've heard a lot is how exceptional Trump is, how completely different he is from what we've seen before or what else is happening in American politics. But I think one of the really interesting things that you do in the essay is explain that it's not a complete disconnection, that there is a through line. Can you talk to us a bit about what that through line is?
Yeah, sure. I think there is still a tendency really to see Trump as an aberration, that he is exceptional, exactly as you said, that he kind of stands apart from American history because he is such an extraordinary figure. But, what I've tried to do with the essay is to examine the historical, I guess, context for Trump and to explain that he isn't an aberration. In fact, what he's doing really is riding the tides of American history. I think in many ways, Trump is the logical consequence of a lot of American history. The Irish writer Fintan O'Toole describes Trump as the kind of result of the unresolved contradictions of American history. So by that, he means going all the way back to the Civil War and the fight against slavery in the United States, which is a foundational conflict for that nation and which was never really resolved. The Americans fought a civil war and got close to resolving the question of enslavement, but that was undone very quickly as Reconstruction was undone and as we moved forward into Jim Crow segregation. All of these divisions of American history have never been resolved, and Trump didn't create those divisions. He's probably the best in living memory at exploiting them and at using them for political ends and at turning Americans against each other. But the reason he could do that is because of the context of American history and really the failure of former leaders, most recently President Biden, but presidents before him, to address those fundamental contradictions. I think the United States has never been one country. It's riven by division. We can see that playing out at the moment. And again, Trump rode that wave and rode it incredibly successfully, but he could do that because of the circumstances of American history.
And we're watching a horrifying new development in Iran at the moment. But again, that seems more part of a consistent series of events rather than a complete aberration. What's the relationship between Trump, Iran, and America's history in countries like Iraq?
Yeah, it's such a good question, isn't it? Because when Trump is framed as an aberration, that's often partly because of his stance or his kind of public stance on American involvement in wars. Trump rose to prominence more recently because he was one of the few, if not the only, conservative leaders or leaders of the far right who said that the Iraq War was a mistake. And we, I think, can't underestimate the appeal of that to many Americans who were exhausted with the forever wars. But what I think many of us underestimated was that wave of American history that, especially in the post-World War II years, is always oriented towards military interventionism. It is always, what is often described as the blob, so the kind of foreign policy establishment made up of the State Department, the Pentagon, and the think tanks that kind of all cycle through each other. The momentum of the blob is always towards interventionism in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Yemen. And Trump is, I guess, unable or unwilling to rein in that momentum. And we saw that in his first administration when he, for example, used what was described as the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan. Trump doesn't abhor war, despite what he says. He loves war, he loves violence, and he loves American power. He loves assertions of power. And so part of the reason we find ourselves in this situation with Iran is because of that history of interventionism, because of Trump's love of displays of strength, and because of that momentum towards intervention. And Iran, I think, is a particularly important case because in that blob that I was talking about, there has always been a particular subset of people who wanted to go after Iran. They saw the Iranian revolution as a catastrophic loss of Iran after a CIA engineered coup there in the 1950s. And really since then, they have been gunning for some kind of American involvement in Iran. In the aftermath of 9/11, in the Bush administration, many of them saw Afghanistan and then Iraq as stepping stones to Iran explicitly. We've got documents that show us that. And so it's completely unsurprising that given an opportunity, there will be people pushing in the administration and without it and outside it for intervention in Iran. And this morning, it very much looks like Trump will go there. And he can do that because of the history that we've been talking about, because previous presidents have been willing and enthusiastic about intervening, about military adventurism. So he's, once again, riding the tide of that history rather than trying to reverse it.
Mm. And when you talk about the blob, this is a field which tends to be dominated by men, predominantly men in suits and uniforms. You happen to be a woman. In a recent conversation review, Professor Mark Beeson noted that you're a young woman.
That's very kind of you.
So I wanted to ask how you strike a tone in this space. You're coming from the perspective of both a historian and a US watcher, very careful analysis, but also your work speaks to a general audience. You're communicating with the Australian public. How do you walk that line?
Yeah, I mean, I think not always successfully. Part of the aim of the essay and the work that we do here at the Australia Institute is to really kind of crack into that international relations foreign policy space, which is totally locked up and dominated almost entirely by men in suits and men in uniform who have conversations and make decisions behind closed doors and really refuse any kind of democratic accountability. And I guess being an outsider to that allows me to do is to point out some of the absurdities, I think, of that space, and to do things like push back on the jargon even of defence and security policy, which is designed to exclude people and to obscure the realities of what foreign policy does. The classic example coming out of the United States is to describe civilian casualties in war as collateral damage. We use these phrases to obscure the reality of what war in particular does to people, and to obscure the deep moral questions that we are refusing to answer. And so what I wanted to do in the essay was to make that language accessible to people and really to try and bring more moral scrutiny, more historical scrutiny onto foreign policy in the United States and in Australia, because, so often foreign policy, especially in Australia, is kind of put above other issues and put above democratic scrutiny, partly because we have a locked-in bipartisan consensus about it. And so people don't feel like they can have opinions on foreign policy or talk about foreign policy because they're not experts. They're not technical experts in, nuclear-powered submarines. So, it's hard to have those conversations, but that's done deliberately to exclude people. And so, I want to highlight the absurdity of that and argue that, in a democracy, we should be having vibrant conversations about our role in the world and our relationship with the United States. And there's no reason that should be put above democratic scrutiny. And I think, we need to particularly face the moral questions of our relationship with the United States head on and talk about them openly and not hide them behind defense jargon and opaque language and closed doors.
And speaking of the moral questions, another point that conversation review made is that unusually your essay also talks about the intersection between climate change policy and security and what that means for Australian safety. Can you talk about your bigger picture thinking and how you connect international relations and climate policy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think international relations, or the discipline or the discussion of international relations, is often focused entirely on what they would describe, I suppose, as hard questions of security. So the prevention of inevitable war, so we talk about weapons and geostrategic influence and things like that, and don't consider catastrophic climate change as a security risk. And that continues despite the fact that it is, that all the evidence shows that climate change is a security risk. It's a direct threat to the security of us and to our neighbours in the Pacific, but it's not treated that way. And I really wanted to highlight particularly the way in which the Trump administration increases the threat to our security, not just in terms of its military adventurism or its military aggression, but in terms of its deliberate undoing of even the inadequate climate action that the previous administrations had been engaged in, because, that means literal threat to the territorial integrity of some of our neighbours. It means literal threat to the safety and security of Australians. And I really wanted to highlight the way in which, we think, well, the Australian government thinks that it's absolutely fine to spend $368 billion on some nuclear-powered submarines that we don't need and we're never likely to get. But when it comes to climate action, we can't afford to act. That's a problem in the future. We can defer action on that problem. And for me, the absurdity of that is really highlighted by the fact that the most prominent activities of the Australian military in the last few years have been things like, being deployed to rescue Australians off a beach in Malakuta. That's the kind of activity that the military has been engaged in. And it's not the kind of activity that they are preparing for in the future, despite the fact that we know that climate-induced disasters like bushfires and floods are going to increase. And the Trump administration is actively ensuring that those disasters will increase by, increasing production of American oil, by opening more gas fields, and by undoing any kind of climate action that existed. And so I wanted to really highlight that the way we talk about security is really poverty-stricken, because we don't talk about climate being a threat to security. We don't talk about the undoing of health policy in the United States being a threat to our security. And I think, maybe what the Trump administration does is actually offer us an opportunity to rethink what we mean when we talk about security and what actually makes us safer.
Even on a practical level, Australia has a number of bases in the north of the country. If it's getting hotter, then there are just fewer days that the people who are based in those locations can train, let alone use whatever technology they have.
That's exactly right. And none of that seems to be in the forward planning about, how our defence forces will operate. And that I think, alongside the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine deal, is a catastrophic failure of forward planning on the part of not just the Australian government, governments worldwide. But that's not inevitable. We can address those problems sometimes by spending a fraction of the amount of money that is dedicated to other defence programs. But that involves a pretty radical rebalancing of priorities and a recognition of that truth, that defence... Got a little fire alarm.
Good timing for a fire alarm test. We won't evacuate and leave you hanging, don't worry.
So I think that investment in those programs, particularly with our partners in the Pacific, and actually acting in good faith when it comes to climate action, could make a huge difference to the role that Australia plays in the world.
This is just to underline the climate emergency that we're currently facing. I think that might be enough of the alarm for now. So you've mentioned these nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines. Can you talk to us about how you have come to understand AUKUS in Australia, what kinds of sources you've used, how you've balanced conversations with peers and academics and other sources, and then the documentary evidence?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's a tricky question to answer, because often, as I was saying earlier, the conversation about AUKUS in particular is dominated by jargon and an insistence that you have to be a detailed expert in nuclear-powered submarines, which I am not. I'm not an expert in defence material. And so, that combination of things and the secrecy around the deal we still know very little about it, make it quite hard to write about and to think about, because we just don't have access to all of the information. So my research around AUKUS has, it kind of comes from a number of different angles. And one of the really striking things about it is that we actually know more about the deal from the American side than we do from the Australian side. So the Americans, as much as American democracy is deeply flawed and in pretty big trouble, are actually much better at transparency than Australia when it comes to defence. So a lot of information comes from the Independent Congressional Research Service, the kind of equivalent of the Parliamentary Library, I suppose, in Australian terms, which has written a number of reports on the AUKUS submarine deal, outlining the considerable problems with the deal, including the fact really that not much planning went into the deal itself. There wasn't a cost-benefit analysis or a real strategic analysis. The Congressional Research Service outlines this really clearly. So that's a really useful source of information, as is talking to people off the record who are involved in Australian defence or defence planning, who are deeply concerned by the deal and its implications, particularly for Australian sovereignty and Australian force posture, which means effectively the implications of this deal and investing so much energy and money into this particular part of the Australian Navy, potentially at the expense of military operations or Air Force operations, for example. So speaking to experts, often on the inside, who are not able to speak publicly about it for a number of reasons, is another way of doing it. But I think also, hopefully, I suppose that one of the advantages that I have is that historical training and a deep understanding of the nature of Australia's relationship with the United States that doesn't just take into consideration that military relationship. I hope that it allows me to take a kind of higher level view of the submarine deal and where it came from and the implications for it. And it allows me to see that, AUKUS, much like Trump, isn't an aberration in Australian defence policy. It's part of a long march, I suppose, towards much deeper integration with the American military industrial complex. It's a kind of logical next step in terms of tying ourselves ever more closely to the United States. So in that way, I would kind of understand AUKUS as a symptom and not a cause of the current issues with the alliance.
And it's been interesting to see in the lead up to the first sitting weeks of the new parliament that the independents have been calling for an inquiry into AUKUS. What kinds of options do you think there are from here? For now, both major parties are representing it as a foregone conclusion. What other options are there?
Yeah, it's probably worth saying that it is pretty extraordinary that both major parties are still, framing AUKUS as a foregone conclusion, given what the Trump administration is doing. It's extraordinary to see Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles still talking about shared values with the United States, which he did a couple of weeks ago, specifically identified those shared values as democracy and the rule of law. Wild. And, putting that in the context of AUKUS, I think has some pretty frightening implications for Australia. So I think it's worth kind of prefacing our conversation with that. I think it's hugely significant that independents are calling for an independent parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS. It's extraordinary that we haven't had one yet, that the biggest transfer of sovereign wealth in Australian history hasn't had any real democratic scrutiny. So I certainly think a parliamentary inquiry is a possibility. We've done polling here at the Australia Institute that indicates majority support amongst the Australian people for a parliamentary inquiry. And so I think there's space for that. I think there's support in the community for it. I don't think the government would take much political flack for doing that. And I think that would be a real opportunity, partly because I'm fairly confident that the AUKUS deal wouldn't survive any kind of actual independent scrutiny, that would provide an off-ramp. And I think we can do that. Australia can do that, where we have a deep well of diplomatic skill in this country that, you know, we could employ to minimize any damage from getting out of that deal through contacts in the US Congress, for example, where Australia is deeply respected. So, you know, I think there are lots of opportunities to get out of the deal. There is the political space for the government to do that. Of course, you know, the opposition in the Liberal Party will make a lot of noise about it, but, you know, they're irrelevant now to those kinds of decisions. And I think there's a clear appetite for opposing the Trump administration, or the worst successes of the Trump administration. And I think it's also worth saying that that doesn't mean abandoning the alliance. That's often how it's framed, that, you know, that leaving AUKUS behind would be catastrophic and would mean the end of the alliance altogether. That's just not true at all. You know, I think we can manage that diplomatically and acknowledge that Australia's relationship with the United States is much deeper and much broader than just AUKUS or just the security alliance. So there's the political space to do that, and we are entirely capable as a grown-up country of coming up with other options to AUKUS and to, you know, as I was saying earlier, really rethinking what we invest in order to make ourselves safer. And I think there's the political opportunity to do that, a very rare one, it has to be said. It's very unusual in the 75-year history of Australia's relationship with America to have an opportunity to rebalance and rethink the foundations of that relationship. And it's one I think we should seize.
And thinking about rebalancing or changes to the relationship, I wonder whether there's scope in terms of relationships with different states within the United States itself. In the essay, you talk about firefighters going and helping in California and vice versa. Governor Gavin Newsom has been very vocal lately. What do you see changing, first of all, in relation, potentially Australia's relationship with states within the US, and also states within the US changing under a Trump administration?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And I'm glad you brought up Newsom, because that's such an important example. And Australia, through the Victorian government, actually already has a memorandum of understanding with California around climate action and trade, because California by itself is an enormous economy as well and has a lot of autonomy. So there are huge opportunities there, I think, for genuine democratic connection between Australian elected representatives and elected representatives in the United States in places like California who have an interest in the survival and the thriving of American democracy. And I think that's a way that Australia can really play a role in, I think, you know, supporting those institutions of American democracy and really leaning into the shared values that Richard Marles identified in democracy and the rule of law. And so that can mean, I think, strengthening those democratic relationships at the state level, also at the federal level with the US Congress, where there is a really strong Friends of Australia caucus, for example. You know, we can broaden that relationship out between democratic connections and away from the kind of closed anti-democratic security relationships. And that can be in areas like climate action. You know, you mentioned, and I write about in the essay, the exchange of firefighters between Australia and the United States, which happens almost every fire season, but is getting much more difficult because of climate change. The fire seasons of the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere are merging, and it's becoming more difficult to justify Australian firefighters going to California, for example, during the California fire season. But reinforcing those connections and investing in, you know, shared equipment and shared expertise and shared research and knowledge building is actually a way to make us safer. You know, I think it's worth, it sometimes feels a bit twee, but in the essay I compare, you know, that exchange of firefighting personnel during catastrophic fire seasons where, you know, during the Black Summer bushfires in Australia, I think upwards of 200 American firefighters came to Australia. You know, does that make us safer than some imaginary nuclear-powered submarines? I think so. You know, I think the evidence suggests that it's those parts of the relationship that actually reinforce our democratic connections and reinforce our security at the same time. And you know, it wouldn't be hard to recalibrate the relationship so that that's what we're investing in. That kind of safety is what we're investing in. That kind of connection and knowledge building and research building is where we can really, I think, recalibrate the relationship so that it is based on shared values and on shared security.
And cutting funds to, say, NOAA and the CDC at the moment would seem to be in direct contravention of both American and international security.
Absolutely. I think it's, so often in Australian media coverage and discussion in Australia about the relationship, AUKUS is kind of separated off as the security question, and then we talk about trade, or then we talk about health, and they're not separate. They're deeply connected. And I think it's so important that you brought up the CDC and health, for example, in the United States, where Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the health secretary, which is extraordinary, and is, busy sacking the vaccine advisory board, which has just unthinkable consequences for the security, the health of Americans and the world, because of course, the United States, for all its flaws, does and has led the world in some of that kind of health research. And undermining that, hollowing it out, has terrible consequences for Americans and for the world. And I've been thinking a lot in particular about that in the context of the dismantling of USAID, which is the foreign aid agency of the United States, where funding for all kinds of programs, including health prevention programs, so AIDS treatment programs, cholera prevention programs, the basic kind of health and security programs that the United States was engaged in running, were cancelled overnight, unilaterally, with just incredible amount of cruelty and betrayal. And a recent study that's come out of Boston University estimates that the dismantling of those funding programs has directly resulted in already upwards of 300,000 deaths across the world, and that will only increase as those health situations and the spread of disease isn't contained by American-led programs. That is, quite obviously a direct threat to security. And I think we need to think about the relationship in those terms, and what Australia can do to step up and fill that gap in order to ensure security, not just in the world, but in Australia as well.
All right, they've finished with their fire alarm testing now, so they won't interrupt us again. We'll turn to questions from the audience now. There are lots of questions. Unhelpfully, there was an interesting declaration on the 11 a.m. news. So that's when we started this webinar.
Oh no.
Claire Bettington has said Trump has just approved an attack on Iran, mentioned in the 11 a.m. news. Is this the beginning of World War III? And if so, will Australia be involved? What do you think?
What a question. Look, I think, without having read the declaration, this is a deeply worrying situation. And as I was saying at the start, the momentum was always towards intervention from the Trump administration. And again, without having read it, I would guess that US involvement will probably start with the Air Force and targeting of underground uranium enrichment facilities in Iran, which Israel just can't do. The United States has to be involved if that's the aim. And that is deeply frightening, because really what that leaves us with is a situation in which we are relying on Iranian restraint. And Iran has been put quite deliberately in an untenable position in that sense, in the initial Israeli attacks and the escalation of that, and the deliberate effort of the Netanyahu government to draw in the Trump administration. Netanyahu has played Trump better than almost anybody else. So it is an incredibly volatile and dangerous situation. I don't know where it will end up, and I don't want to make predictions. In terms of Australia's role, I think that is deeply worrying. The history of Australia's relationship with the United States that I write about in the essay is one of following the United States into every war that it has fought, really since the end of the Second World War, with very few exceptions, no matter where and no matter why. And the momentum appears to still be heading that way, even despite what the Trump administration is doing. And so that is deeply concerning for Australia, but I think there will be, I think there would be deep community resistance in Australia to any kind of involvement in an incredibly dangerous war like that. And so I suppose we just have to wait and see what the Australian government says in response, but it is a deeply worrying situation. And again, I think we are partly in it because of a refusal to acknowledge and understand who Donald Trump is and the danger that he poses to the rest of the world.
Sue Eaton says, I understand Trump as a product of US history, or that he is a product of US history, but how much of what is happening now is actually his administration pulling the strings?
I think that's a very good question. I think a lot of what is happening now is the result of people in the Trump universe learning the lessons of the first administration. So during the first administration, Trump was relatively restrained by a bureaucracy and by, particularly in the national security space, hires who still adhered to kind of old ideas about America's role in the world. So, people like, for example, Trump's I think he was Defense Secretary Mark Esper, who refused to allow the deployment of the military against protesters during the first Trump administration. Those people don't exist anymore. And they are able and willing to pull the levers of American power and understand how to use them in a way that the first Trump administration just didn't. So the answer to the question is kind of yes and no. I think that, the Trump administration is pulling the strings, it is deploying the military against its own people, but part of the reason it can do that is because of the space that was opened up by previous administrations, particularly in the foreign policy space where Congress was, just unwilling to rein in the president, for example, so Trump can use that space and take advantage of it, and he's doing it very successfully.
We have a question from Anthony Kritikos. Is Trump heading towards a dystopian authoritarian USA as depicted in various novels, for example, by Margaret Atwood, Octavia Butler, etc.?
Oh, so glad you mentioned Octavia Butler, who is my go-to for so much of understanding, American politics. That's The Parable of the Sower is a beautiful book, and I really would highly recommend it. I don't think necessarily that reality will reflect that kind of fiction, but it is worth saying, and I actually wrote about this a little, not in this essay, but in another piece about the tech bros' affinity to science fiction and fantasy in particular. And, the way that they are kind of taking all of the exact wrong messages out of those classics of science fiction in order to quite deliberately implement a kind of dystopia where the wealthy few hold all the power and are busy colonizing Mars at the expense of the vast majority of the American people. I think that is the project of people like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel, for example, who co-founded Palantir, which draws its name from the Lord of the Rings. I think it's really true that all of these tech bros and the people around Trump who read that kind of science. I don't think they were reading Octavia Butler. That's just a guess. But, they see themselves kind of as the resistance, but they've always been the empire.
We have a question from Milos Karapanjic, who asks, what are the key elements driving that wave of American history that led to Trump?
I think in a word, it's enslavement. It's the history of structural racism in the United States. Trump came to power trading off racist ideas about immigration in the United States. He literally used the term vermin to describe immigrants and conspiracies against him, which is drawn straight out of the fascist playbook. And the United States has a long history of its own kind of racially based fascism and a white supremacist idea that non-white people are coming for the predominantly white power structures in the United States. That's what Trump does. That's the historical division that he preys on so successfully. And, he is building on the history of segregation, of Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, for example, on Ronald Reagan's particular form of racism. And it's been very, very successful in the United States at fostering division, at allowing space for white supremacy, and on obscuring the questions about who has power in the United States. So I think, without being glib about it, the history of racism in the United States is one of the biggest explanatory factors for Trump.
Alistair McCulloch has posted the current headline on the NYT is Trump says he hasn't made up his mind on Iran strikes.
Okay.
In a day of cryptic hints, President Trump offered no timetable for a decision to order US forces to join Israel's attacks on Iran's nuclear sites, saying, I like to make a final decision 1 second before, just in time, apparently.
Reassuring.
And also Alistair McCulloch has a question, which is back in the 1980s when the US was trying to base cruise missiles in the UK, the view of many was that the US viewed the UK as an unsinkable aircraft carrier off the coast of Europe. Recently, I've started to wonder whether this is how the US is now viewing Australia, as an unsinkable aircraft carrier lying off the coast of China. What do you think?
I think there's a long history of the United States viewing Australia in that way. It was a term coined decades ago, was that Australia is a suitable piece of real estate. The reason that Pine Gap is where it is in the middle of Australia is purely geographical. You know, during the Cold War, that was the place far enough away that could observe Soviet activities without also being detected or reachable by the Soviets. So that has always been a convenience, really, to the United States, and explains partly how the United States treats Australia and is treating Australia now. Historically, Australian governments have kind of understood that as a subservient relationship, but it doesn't necessarily have to be framed that way. And some other experts are kind of suggesting that, you know, the United States needs us more than we need them in that sense, and that, you know, that could contribute partly to a rebalancing of the relationship. But I think being really clear-eyed about why the Trump administration might want that relationship with Australia, how closely that ties us to Trump administration aggressiveness and provocation towards China, being really clear-eyed about that is critical for Australia, and understanding that our interests in the region, and particularly with our relationship with China, are very different to the interests of the Trump administration.
We have a question from Karen Jones, who asks, what can we do to get the Office of National Intelligence Assessment of Climate-Related Security Risks report released to the public?
It's a good question, and a lot of people have been trying to get that report. You know, I think freedom of information requests might have already gone through. That is a way to do it. But I think, you know, broader pressure on the Australian government around secrecy laws, around transparency, is building, around whistleblowers as well, I think is building. And in this moment, you know, where Australia is understood as rightly as a, you know, imperfect but quite vibrant democracy, there's it's hard to prosecute the argument, really, that we need that kind of secrecy about critical questions about Australia's future, like what kind of security risk climate poses to Australia. And I think, you know, with this government and with the role of independence, we have a real opportunity to begin to reform those secrecy laws. And again, as I was saying earlier, you know, to take some lessons from the United States, as flawed as it is, which, you know, is better, I think, at transparency, and has situations where congressional committees, for example, have subpoena power, so they can compel the release of that kind of evidence in a way that Australian committees can't do. And so I think those kinds of lessons of reinforcing, once again, you know, those shared democratic values is potentially a way forward. But, you know, I think it's really important to bring up that we don't have access to those kinds of landmark reports, and we absolutely should.
And we can pick and choose which lessons we would like to learn.
We can.
We don't have to import the Electoral College. We can choose some of the transparency measures. Jennifer Durand asks, how economically dependent is Australian trade on America? How independent of America can Australia become?
That is a really good question. I think probably Trump's tariffs really highlight the nature of our economic relationship with the United States, which is broad and deep. But when it comes to those tariffs on steel and aluminium, you know, without minimizing the effect that that's had on those particular industries, the broad effect on the Australian economy is relatively small. And, you know, when Trump is threatening Australia around beef imports, for example, you know, it's quite clear that there's there are other markets for those products. The supply and demand exists, and we don't have to panic about that kind of relationship. And we also, I think, have a lot of leverage in that relationship. Australian super, for example, has huge investments in the American economy and has an interest in the stability of the American economy. And so the relationship isn't one way. I think it's really important not to underestimate our economic power here in Australia, and not to overestimate the US's influence. Part of the reason that Trump's tariffs have been relatively unsuccessful in what he wants them to do, and part of the reason he's walked them back, is because the United States is just not as important to the global trading environment as Donald Trump assumed it was.
And thank you for mentioning super. It's a good opportunity to remind everyone that Australia Institute research has found that most superannuation funds have investments in nuclear weapons manufacturing. So it's a good opportunity to check your superannuation fund and whether your money is going to the development and sale of nuclear weapons. Kevin O'Day says the Pine Gap facility involves Australia in any war that the Americans take on. Does Australia have any room to move in such conflicts? And this relates to a question that Claire Bettington had as well about when will we change the rules so it's not just the PM's decision to go to war?
Yeah, two really, really good questions. And I think Trump's actions in Iran will probably once again highlight the need for war powers reform in Australia, to make that decision, not one made by, behind closed doors by cabinet or by the Prime Minister, but one, subject to parliamentary scrutiny. That question comes up periodically when American military adventurism accelerates, and I suspect it will again. And it's coming up in the United States as well, where Congress is attempting to restrain the Trump administration when it comes to Iran, and will likely be ignored. So they are really important questions. In that sense, Pine Gap is a really quite difficult one, because Australia is deeply integrated into those intelligence systems, and would have trouble extracting itself. In all honesty, if an Australian government ever wanted to reform the arrangements around Pine Gap or to extract Australia totally, that would be diplomatically extremely difficult. And I think the Australian government, in failing to plan for Trump, in failing to recognise that a second Trump administration was entirely possible, lost an opportunity with the Biden administration to build some guardrails around Pine Gap in particular, and Australian involvement in the American security umbrella, which we are now deeply implicated in. And I think the Australian government will have to be very careful going forward, given what's happened in Iran. I don't know the answer to Pine Gap. I don't think anybody does. But it's very striking to me that anecdotally it's coming up a lot in conversations I have with people. The question about why are we going to Trump to offer him whatever he wants to hold on to the AUKUS deal? Why aren't we saying, Jackie Lambie style, well, if you're going to put tariffs on us, if you're going to treat us like this, then, we'll close Pine Gap. Even the fact that we're having those conversations is a potentially, I think, seismic shift in the way we think about our relationship with the United States. But I also think we shouldn't underestimate the kind of blowback that would come from the United States if anyone in the Australian government, I don't think they will, but if they ever chose to go down that path. And again, that's why I think that the failure to plan for Trump was a catastrophic failure of governance.
Brian O'Farrell asks, notwithstanding Biden, to what extent can previous Democrat governance be said to have contributed to enabling the mood for Trump, and what changes would need to happen to restore normality to them and the GOP?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, Nick Bryant, who wrote a book called The Forever War, explains this beautifully. I would really highly recommend that book. But I think, many historians and experts have rightly identified the Obama administration's response to the global financial crisis as an enabler of Trump. The Obama administration's refusal to effectively punish the architects of that crisis and to redirect support to working class Americans facing desperate insecurity really, I think, paved the way for Donald Trump, for his arguments around the hollowing out of the Rust Belt, his arguments blaming China for the hollowing out of the Rust Belt. his arguments blaming immigrants for the hollowing out of the Rust Belt. Trump is so good at identifying problems, in identifying American working class insecurity and middle class insecurity that existed before the financial crisis, but was kind of turbocharged by that. And the Obama administration's failure to recognize that and to engage in the kind of deep structural economic reform that I think arguably the United States really needs, again, opened up that kind of space for Trump. And the Democrats' continual refusal to identify problems and reflect them back to Americans, this insistence on kind of technocratic tinkering around economic policy, the reinforcement of dramatic wealth inequality, the failure to act on things like universal healthcare, the Obama administration's reforms notwithstanding, that opened up space for Trump. And Democrats are still, many Democrats, particularly the leadership of the party, are still refusing to grapple with that and their responsibility for him.
And your analysis of those questions in the essay, I think, is really excellent. I think we have time just for one last question. This one comes from David Carr, who asks, is America moving quickly back to the Monroe Doctrine with regard to foreign affairs?
Actually, Hugh White writes about this really nicely in his recent quarterly essay. And I think that is arguably true. You can see, so the Monroe Doctrine is really that the United States has a right to control the so-called Western Hemisphere, so the Americas, broadly speaking. And certainly you can see that in Trump's foreign policy, if we can call it that, in his threats to annex Canada, his threats on the Panama Canal, his renaming of the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America. This is all kind of inspired, I suppose, by the Monroe Doctrine. I think, though, that historical reality is often conflated with what's often described as isolationism. So Trump is described as an isolationist who is withdrawing the United States kind of into its borders. The United States he described as surrounded by two big, beautiful oceans that offer protection. I think it's important to say that Trump is not an isolationist. We can see that even in the last hour in terms of the way the United States is operating in Iran. So it's true that Trump is kind of revitalizing the Monroe Doctrine, but I would emphasize that doesn't mean a withdrawal of American power. It doesn't mean isolationism. It means a different kind of exercise of American power, a much more aggressive one.
Well, thank you, Emma. I'm really delighted that After America is the first essay in the Vantage Point series. You can find it in your local bookshop or on the Australia Institute website. Thank you so much for chatting today.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming along, everyone, and for your genuinely excellent questions. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube and to follow our podcasts, Dollars and Cents, After America, and Follow the Money. Next month, we'll be talking to Jane Rawson about human nature. I hope to see you there.
Thanks for watching. We love that we can make these videos free to watch, but they're not free to make. It's thanks to our generous supporters that we can keep making research and content that changes minds. So, if you like what we do, please consider giving to the Australia Institute so we can keep doing it. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au and click the donate button to see how your support can help fund high quality research that matters.